All right, one moment. Let me just get this thing set up. Oh, it doesn't seem to want to detect that. That's odd. One moment. Why does it not want to detect this screen? That is strange. All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to get OBS to actually capture. All right, there we go. Sorry, I'm just trying to get OBS to actually capture. Brilliant. Okay. So, reminder. In fact, I think maybe we could just trim that down, sort of like that, kind of like right in the middle there. Does that look ugly? Do we want to keep that on?
No, I think that works. Move it.
That works.
Yeah, move it
Okay.
so we can see the Fight the Empire logo.
Oh yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking, but it's also like it's a little too. It's a little too
Yeah, I guess we're
centered there.
kind of yeah, I guess we're kind of a little awkward.
I guess for the time being, what I could do is just like that, and then we'll figure it out next time. And I'll do a. Here, we'll do that.
All right.
There we go. Little inelegant, but there we go. And I'll make a new banner for next time. Okay, so welcome to the very cringily labeled Fight the Empire podcast / thing. Essentially, this is an ongoing project on my channel um, to go over the history of how we got to where we are in our world today, involving the efforts of different scholars, academics, and otherwise interested and intelligent people in my community who are taking it upon themselves to plan and host seminar discussions on various topics pertaining to the history of imperialism and so on and so forth. To start with, we are focusing on an anchor book just to sort of give us ideas for what to cover, and that is Empires of the Atlantic World by J.E. Eliot, right? By J.H. Eliot, pardon me.
H, I think. I didn't bring that
J.H.
one
Eliot.
upstairs with me. It's down on my reading couch.
Totally fine. You don't need to have any reading background in this to follow along. However, if you do want to follow along, there are suggested readings in the server for each scheduled talk if you want to have a really close read of it. But and Daedalus, I'm reminded to remind you to speak into the mic when you're speaking.
Yeah, I have your chat
You
up
have
too. I see you there, Pippa.
there you go. Um, So, without further ado, Daedalus Media of the Two Guys Talking History channel is hosting our first episode. This is all members only for the simple reason that this is very dense material that is not very like algorithm friendly. And so, if it was not members only, it would hurt my channel in the algorithm, which would be very hurtful for me. So, if you would like to support my channel and watch it here and take part in the side chat and the most active side chat, please donate a membership. And so, sorry, please consider getting a membership and/or donating memberships. They are 99 cents Canadian each. They are not very expensive. However, if for whatever reason you cannot get one of those, either it's not gifted to you or that's just prohibitive for whatever reason, you will also be able to watch this conversation, this seminar on Daedalus's channel, and that will be the case for all host channels. At Two Guys Talking History on YouTube. Without further ado, Daedalus, I'm going to turn it over to you. You are in charge now. I'm just the butler. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Sunday. All right. Good evening, everyone. Let's make sure you can hear me. Am I talking in the mic enough for you, Pippa? Is that it? Okay. So I thought tonight we should start with something a little bit foundational, because a lot of times we kind of run into these problems where we talk about historical concepts and we have similar words using to describe them, and we don't really explore or analyze what makes them different. So I've been reading this book. Actually, I'm rereading it throughout the year, the Israeli-Palestine conflict by James Galvin, and he starts off by talking about nationalism and empires and how those affected the Ottomans and the Palestinians in particular, and the Zionists and Jewish populations of Europe. And I thought this would be a good place to start because you have a very, very like easy to digest way to get involved with that. So that's kind of where we're starting tonight. But even before that, I think it's really good to start with a very popular piece on the American Historical Association website called "What Does It Mean to Think Historically?" And I'm going to throw that up in chat in both chats now. And this is where I get the famous 5 C's card that we made here for Two Guys Talking History. This is where those 5 C's come from. And this is kind of like a baseline to kind of get students involved at any grade level and get students involved in how to do history beyond just merely reading a book and getting into facts and dates. And he outlines these 5 C's and what they are. And like this is, I think, before we start and talk about what empire was and how it evolves, let's talk about how we look at how it evolves. And this is again fairly famous. I enjoyed it. But the 5 C's are change over time, context, causality, contingency, and probably the foundational one, complexity.
Daedalus, is this something you'd like me to put on the screen?
Yeah, if we can. Let me send it.
I think you can just share it here as well, and I can just blow it up on the screen here.
Oh, I can't I?
In fact, before you continue, what I'm actually going to do very quickly is I'm going to set up a second screen so I can just easily transition between full screen and smaller. So give me one moment. Hold that thought. I'm just going to center you here. Get your pretty face covering as much of the screen as possible. There we go. Make that a little bit smaller. A little bit smaller. Why is that so big? There we go. Okay. And then boop, boop, boop. And bring that down. Put that right there. Perfect. Okay. And then when you're showing that on screen, I should be able to just go boop, boop, boop. There we go. Okay. All right, you're good to go.
All right, excellent. And I put that up for us here, Two Guys. So this is the first concept is change over time. You see this a lot. I think people kind of intrinsically understand that the world that they live in now is not the world that we lived, that our ancestors lived in before. But this is also really useful to think about because you will see as you kind of navigate through these readings a lot of people misrepresent these concepts because right now talking about imperialism is kind of hot button, and they kind of take and talk about these things as if the thing that was is still the thing that is. For example, one of the big arguments you'll see here in the United States is people argue that the Democrats were the party that it was the party of slavery, and therefore it's obnoxious that African Americans vote for Democrats, ignoring all the things that happened between 1865 and today. So this is, I think, a very useful thing to keep in mind is that, especially tonight when we're talking about empires and nationalism and this kind of 400, 500 year process that kind of gives us the empires that we're going to be talking about, is that from where they started is not the same thing as where they were. And this is my favorite, actually, is the next one is context. So context is kind of where a lot of people get history wrong. They like to present history as like a event and what happened, and that's it, and then nothing about why that event happened. And this is a really easy way to like lose people when you're teaching history too, is to avoid the context of what we're talking about and how we're talking about it. So one of the things I'm hoping that we get to do in these readings as we assign them is sort of explore the context that is the times and the way people thought about these things and how it differs from the way we think about them, and so we can kind of see that fluctuation and that change. And I think there's a couple of good readings. A couple of you guys pointed out some of the primary source passages that Gelvin put in here. I think Palmdad just did right before the thing, talking about how you have this woman who is in Palestine writing about this supposedly ancient land and how it all is. And Palmdad, being Palmdad, marks that there is a plant that was just been introduced to the region, the prickly pear. So I think that's a lot of interesting opportunities we're going to have for that going forward. And causality, I think, is another one. Uh, Things cause other things. I had a history teacher in high school who taught a bunch of classes, actually. He taught both me and Hetman, my co-host, who might be joining us for some of these. And he had before he retired, I was one of his last students, actually. I drove him to retirement after 2 years. Uh, he had a giant web for his AP European class of all of the principal topics covered in the class and how they interconnected to one another. And it was a very messy but interesting visual way to see that. If you look behind me, you'll see a timeline that does something similar that one of my nephews got me. Uh, you see how these things sort of relate one to the other, and uh, how to separate which ones don't relate. It's just another easy thing to do. We talk about logical fallacies sometimes. We talk about the fallacy post hoc ergo propter hoc, after it, therefore, because of it, and how that can not necessarily always be true. And this is one of those things we take and we look at events and we take documents and sources and we look at those and we say, okay, I see this, and now I see how this relates to this other event here. And it's a really it frames the discussion in such a way that lets you take out extemporaneous information from your analysis. And contingency is one of those tricky things. So contingency is how events are dependent upon one another. We have marched inexorably here to where we are from what we have done, but that does not mean that it was deterministic and that was the only thing that could possibly have happened. So what contingency looks at is mostly to understand how what you and I do, both as people and as actors in a larger context, is interconnected and how it might affect people going forward, and how we were affected in turn by the people who acted before us. There is nothing that we do and nothing that we are going to look at that hasn't been designed, I guess is the best way, by the actions that came before. People come over from the sea. Columbus comes over from the sea and he interacts with native populations, and those native populations make actions and make choices, and Columbus makes choices, and that results in the events of Columbus and his ultimate trial going forward. So these are all things we want to keep in mind, is how these events interrelate. And I think complexity is kind of the big one. Like I said, it's foundational to what we're kind of doing here. It would be one thing to get up and do my show every week and say, well, this is what happened 500 years ago. These events are not necessarily a simple explanation. The phrase that they use here is the moral, epistemological, and causal complexity distinguish historical thinking from the conception of history held by many non-historians. In short, it's the difference between reciting facts and dates and the concept of understanding those dates and understanding those facts and being able to place them and build a narrative around them. And this is I think the mark of good history is who can tell the best story with the best facts that we have at the time. So that's a lot to get going with. And so before we kind of move on, and I know people have asked me to talk about this in the past, before we kind of move on, I want to invite people to see if they have any questions.
I think people can raise their hand to be
Yes,
brought up onto the stage. So if you're in the chat and you want to speak, you're able to raise your hand and then come on that way. But don't feel like you have to. It's entirely optional. Doesn't look like
I'm going to
anybody is
check
doing
both
so.
chats. Yeah. And we'll move on in a minute or two. Dinesh D'Souza's propaganda. Yes, Dinesh D'Souza is a big victim of, or rather perpetrator of, shoddy historical arguments. Chapter Black. I'm going to let you in here. All right. You're muted if you want to speak.
Oh, just the FYI, Chapter Black, if you're trying to speak right now, we can't hear a word you're saying.
Are we typing? What's happening?
No, no dice. It's all good.
All right. Apologies then. Nope, that's not the menu I want.
Oh, his audio is apparently consistently very bad. Okay. How do we remove? There you go.
There we go. Excellent. Okay. We'll figure this thing out someday.
Yeah.
This is probably the worst duo to put in charge of the first stage used in the
I know,
cathedral.
right?
Yes, it is on Discord in the cathedral. There is a link somewhere in Sunday's description, I think, still, possibly.
I'll update that very quickly.
All right. So.
All right. Yeah.
There is starting, and I did not read the PDF. I read my personal copy, so my pages will be wrong for everyone else who read the PDF. But very quickly, in the chapter Cultures and Nationalism, Gelfand decides to talk about what nationalism does and what nationalism is in the context of how it affects nations. And the first thing he points out, I think that's important, is that nationalists tend to believe that they are manifesting this sense of the nation in the people. And the reality, he points out, is that they are in fact creating the nations themselves. They're building these concepts, this sense of identity that undergirds nationalism and changes how people relate to where they live in reality, right? So nationalism is kind of very European in its invention. You have these kingdoms that pop up after Rome and after Charlemagne that are largely defined by local matters. So England being a great example, you'll have individual nobles in control of an area gifted to them by the king, and the people who live in that area are ostensibly bound to that area, or they're bound to areas of the church, for example. And they live there, and that's their world for the most part. There isn't really a lot of association with a larger concept of the King of England. It's that old Monty Python bit. Oh, you're the king? Well, I didn't vote for you. And one of the questions I asked is, what is the goal of nationalist? And I think the nationalist, or the goal of nationalism as promulgated by nationalists, and I think the best way to put that is that the goal of nationalists is really to build a advantage for themselves in their local spheres of influence. Nationalism itself kind of is a long road, and the fundamental building block of it is this concept of sovereignty, right? We rule. So this emerges after the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia that ends the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War, if you've watched What If Altist, he references it quite often, badly. But the 30 Years' War is a somewhat religious, but mostly political conflict that engulfs most of the Holy Roman Empire, which is modern-day Germany, from 1618 to 1648. It's a big, long, complicated thing. But for our purposes, the principal objective of all of these parties is ostensibly to put their own faction in control of the Holy Roman Empire, or to stop someone from putting their own faction in control of it. France, in particular, was involved in that. And this is a emerging of politics and religion, and the principal framing of the conflict is a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. It starts off in Bohemia, modern day Czechoslovakia. Uh, a couple of Protestants get tossed out a window, and this snowballs into a conflict, a much larger war that devastates the Holy Roman Empire. After they get together, the principal parties, Sweden and France and other nations, get together, Spain, and they divide up much of Europe between themselves, and they start establishing this principle of sovereignty. And this starts a long, slow road where the nations of Europe kind of see the effect of these religious conflicts and start to look for ways out and ways to secure an advantage. And to do this, they need to move the primacy of what the people are working towards and see as their loyalties to something larger, to this concept of the sovereign in these cases, which would more often than not be a king. And so what happens is you see this evolution of things like legal codes and you see evolutions of legal codes and standardized education systems, and this slowly inculcates people with this concept that they are part of a larger group. You're not just a guy living in Brittany, you're now a Frenchman. And it also starts to highlight an us versus them mentality. You're not just a guy living in Brittany, you're a Frenchman, and Englishmen are bad. And this kind of concept isn't new, but formalizing it is. For example, you can go back into medieval history and you can see things like the 100 Years' War, well before any of these events happen, and you can see this sense of, oh, I'm an Englishman fighting for the English, or I'm a Frenchman fighting for the French. And so this starts to create what Gelbin calls a culture of nationalism. And he doesn't argue that this is nationalism itself, but he argues it is a precursor to the creation of nationalism. And it's unique because it starts to give people a sense of self and a connection in a certain way to at least who they expect to be their rulers. For example, if you look back in the history of Spain or the Holy Roman Empire, you'll often see the Habsburg family is sitting as a dual crown between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So oftentimes you could have a ruler that didn't even live in the place that they were ostensibly ruling. This becomes less and less common as we move towards the 19th century, and that's really when nationalism takes off. There's some hints of it early on in the Napoleonic Wars. 1813, there's the Battle of Leipzig, which is also referred to as the Battle of Nations, because it's the first time that a lot of smaller European nations that have mostly been pushed around by the coalitions of France organize themselves, fight on their own behalfs, and engage in this, getting this sense of pride and nationalism that they might not otherwise have had throughout the course of the Napoleonic Wars. And this progresses throughout the 19th century. You see concepts like the Revolution of 1848, which is a series of events throughout Europe, principally in France, where they start really defining a sense of personhood for people and a sense of being a part of a nation. And this progresses on, and it also starts, you also see concurrently this development of an idea of having to have control of populations both at home and overseas. So those education systems get turned into mandatory systems, mandatory education, which has benefits, but also obvious downsides if you're in a place where your education isn't really manifestly concurrent with your culture. Yes, yes, technically the Holy Roman Empire is a bit more than Germany, but it works.
And just a reminder, Daedalus, if you need me to put anything up on the screen, just let me know.
No, I'm just working off of my notes right now.
Okay, you're all good. I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure.
And
See the
so,
unpaid labor in the background.
well, well, if you wanna intervene or yell at me, go ahead for it. Um.
No, no, you're all good. I'm referring to your furry friend on the.
Oh, hey, be cute. Be a good boy. That was a mistake. Now he's gonna come over. Yep. All right. And so, typically, when you go and you take a history course, your European history course, it's been a while since I took one, but typically they point out nationalism starts in like mid 19th century Europe. And through this process of colonization, that's sort of how it propagates throughout the world. But it also affects how we look at cultures, right? The one of the principal things I think is particularly in American history, which I spend most of my time with, we came over here, we started building these colonies and settlements, and we started interacting with the natives, and we did not see the complexity of their societies in the same way. And this caused us to discount them because we didn't see them as similar to us. You can find that in a lot of the writings of early Europeans. And this also caused our early settlers to fundamentally underestimate the native populations as well, and how adaptive they were and to our presence, and the danger they could pose. I think we're going to get to some point, because I want to talk about it because no one does, King Philip's War. Conflict between the New England colonists and the local native tribes, where the natives just absolutely kicked the colonists' teeth in. Very early on, 1600s. Doesn't get talked about in American history that often for reasons that surpass all understanding. But it's an interesting way to kind of see how our view of that we got from nationalism of ourselves affected how we saw others, and how it became acceptable and permissible, both as a but both to exploit other nations, but also to exploit other peoples that we considered less advanced. There's a very dramatic difference between the slavery, for example, that we're going to talk about in the Roman Empire in a few minutes here, and the chattel slavery system that took over Europe and North America and the Caribbean and South America. There's a very dramatic difference between how those people who were enslaved were seen by the enslavers, and it's a nationalism plays into that. So you see all of these things that require bureaucracy and organization and communication, that become more and more possible over time. Sorry, I'm just catching my breath here for a second. And I think, again, I want to pause and offer people the option to ask some questions if they desire.
And just a reminder, this is the first episode, so it's kind of a test. So don't feel like you need to like drag it on extensively if you're tired.
No, I think we're gonna aim for. Let me check my timer here. I think we're gonna aim for me getting it. No, we're at 30 minutes. Yeah, I think it would be about hour 15 when we get all said and done.
Okay, sounds good.
We never do
yeah, if
streaming
anybody,
for too awfully long at Two Guys because I'm an old man.
well, these are also all going to be evening streams, and they're going to be directed by a guest, so it's not
Yeah.
going to be like crazy long. We're aiming for more consistency and frequency than length, so they're not going to be terribly onerous. They're going to be typically within the hour to hour and a half range. Is my vision. So more than anything, like what they're about is just making it so that there's like a consistent conversation going on. So it's not like every single one needs to be like this crazy like 6 hour thing. If people decide they have the energy for that, like by all means. But I also full time as well, so it's going to be like if I'm here for all of these, it's like okay,
New objective.
So we're not gonna go nuts. Yeah.
Doesn't look like there's any requests. Let's check chat. I was taught by the Australians the English were very practiced at colonialism, prompting the declaration of terra nullius. I do have a question. Are we identifying nationalism a 19th century phenomenon, or something that was, in a sense, during the 17th, 18th century? I would kind of argue that we kind of get it beginning during the 17th century, because
Well, maybe a factor here too, just to jump in there a little bit,
sure,
is that like when we're talking about nationalism, it's like, are we talking about a specifically modern phenomena that is understood as an ism, or are we talking about something that we're sort of redescriptively characterizing as sort of bearing the latent properties of what we call nationalism today? Because like when we talk about nationalism today, we're not just talking about like, oh, here's a set of behaviors. We're often talking about like a position that people will self-consciously adopt as a stance, and so on and so forth. And so it's a bit more complicated. And so like when people are talking about the birth of nationalism, it's like, well, it as with everything, it depends on what specifically you mean, and more specifically what you're excluding from that definition.
yeah.
So
Sorry.
yeah, go on.
I think the biggest thing I want to point out is that this didn't just pop out of the ground in someone's idea and go, haha, we're Germany now, or haha, we're France now. These had to be like, these were consequences of actions taken and people deciding to do things that change how we people relate to. I don't want to say I hate this part. I don't want to say the nation when I'm speaking of kingdoms, but the polity that we lived in, and how those polities are related. There's a great bit I like. If you guys watch Attaché Films, he has moved on to doing this series of the American Revolution, and so far it's very good. He's done 2 episodes, I think. Maybe he's done another one. I haven't looked in a while. But the first one, he talks about kind of how liberalism supplants. The dog is getting fed. How liberalism supplants the sense of feudalism. I guess is a tricky word, but how liberalism supplants the feudal order.
What's the dog getting fed to, Daedalus?
The dog isn't getting fed. The dog is being fed. Actually, my roommate has 2 cats, and I have a dog, and they all eat at the same time, and he will try to steal the cat's food before he eats his own, so he has to be put in his kennel for 5 or 6 minutes and then let out, and then he will go steal the cat's food and then maybe eat his own, because the cats get wet food and it's much better than kibble. So yeah, I think like the impression I don't want to give, and I'm using the word because it's the best word I have. I'm using the word nationalism. I don't want to give the impression that nationalism and nationalists are a thing throughout 400 years of history. They're not. But it is a process. It is something that becomes a thing over time. It's that change over time again. Not nations in the Anthony Smith sense, but more some sort of precursor to nations that emerge later. Yeah, there is a concept, I think, that nationalists have, that the nation is a continuous thing, especially in nations that can have very clear traces of roots. So France is a big one. The French Republic is not, for example, the French monarchy in any sense, but they will claim a history and a tradition that runs back to that. Israel is a great example that, as we go through this, if you decide to read on through this book, I think it might even be in this chapter that Galvin makes a comparison to modern day Israel, referencing back to Josephus and how he wrote about the uprisings in against the Romans in the 1st century CE. That is very much a thing that nationalists do and try to present as a way to legitimize the concept of the nation, which is interesting in and of itself, I think. And I suspect Sunday would agree that they feel the need to legitimize it at all, that they don't just presume it to be the thing that exists, therefore it should exist. Does that make
Well,
sense?
what's kind of interesting is, yeah, I was. It brings to mind something that I've cited like years ago. Oh shoot, what is his name? German guy. Give me a second. Give me a second. Um,
Do you have any idea how that doesn't narrow it down?
I know, right? I know. Um, shoot. He's cited by Schmidt. What is his name again? God damn it. God damn it. Is it The State and Man? Was that the book? Um, begins with a V. Begins with a V. The last name. Uh, not Spengler. Not Spengler.
Oswald Spengler doesn't begin with a V. All right, we've got 42 German philosophers from Google. Let's check them all.
Yeah, my brain is absolutely terrible when it comes to ever since I got COVID, man. Like I swear to God,
A lot of
like
people who have gotten COVID have mentioned that they're brain fogged to death now. I
I'm
have,
not even brain fogged. I just literally cannot remember like proper nouns, like names. I can't do.
knock on
All right,
wood,
it
I have
drives me.
avoided COVID for the 5 years of it's been around, which is probably good when you consider my situation. But
Vogel? Is it Vogel? I don't know if it's
Joseph
Vogel.
Vogel?
No.
No, that's not it.
Um, Vogelin. Eric Vogelin. That's it. That's what I was. God, that was embarrassing. Eric Vogelin. Eric Vogelin wrote a book on the history of nationalism, and one of the things that he digs into. This is not like unique to him. This is a fairly like common account. But he talks about how there was a certain pride that directly oriented around the exact same national construct that would become nationalism after the French Revolution among the French nobility. They considered it a part of their they had a good, it was very condescending and very arrogant, but they had a good natured pride around their role as of the race of the conquerors as opposed to the common folk who were not. And it was only once they were driven out and had to flee to Germany and were suddenly on the defensive and had lost all of their power that all of a sudden they gained this negative notion of, oh, we were their betters, but the riffraff they rose up and now we need to put down. And now all of a sudden when they're losing, that good natured, oh, fair's fair, we won, just is what it is, don't hate the player, hate the game, that whole attitude's gone. And then
Yeah,
all of a sudden you have this defensive notion, because that first one you're fine living among other nations. Why? Because you're the boss, you're the man. But then all of a sudden when you're not, it's like, oh, now you have now you're suddenly aware of a defensive skin that's been violated around your supremacy. And now all of a sudden you have a nationalism where it's like, this isn't just a thing that's sort of in your mind where you're very proud of your heroic conquering heritage. Now it's like, no, now you're defensive of this domain that you've attached to some notion of race, um, that is threatened by other peoples and whatnot. And so you have a nationalism that becomes an obsessive paranoid focus.
it kind of reminds me in a way, similar time frame of Edmund Burke and how he kind of approaches it too, the French Revolution. Because his attitude towards the American Revolution is dramatically different. Like he's basically, I don't. Basically, it boils down to why are we bothering to try to keep these people with us? They're just gonna fail anyway. Just leave them to it. Uh, when the French Revolution comes around, stopping it becomes paramount to him. He's offended by the nature of it. It's like he's terrified that this concept migrated back across the ocean. Uh, the peasants are revolting type thing that you read from Burke
Yeah.
is it's a bad joke. It's a dad joke. I did it. You can't stop me.
Oh my God. That's terrible. All right, press on.
All right. And so this kind of brings us to really how what the meat of what I want to talk about. What is an empire? And what was an empire? And this is a kind of a semi-contentious topic, I think, even today. There's a book that came out 2 years ago called Myth America, and I would name the author, but it's edited by a couple of fairly prominent American historians, and each one is a micro essay about like what are common myths in the American political discourse, and historians are pushing back against what these myths are. And one of the essays is America an empire? And the short answer is yes. But it's not an empire that you would recognize like Rome, for example. So a point that Galvin makes, and I think is fair, is that empires are among the earliest large-scale political organization that we know of in human history. Outside of smaller polities like city-states, empires are kind of the first next big thing. So the earliest example of an empire that we cite in history, and this doesn't preclude the fact that there might be earlier ones that we don't know about, but it's the Akkadian Empire. And the Akkadian Empire is founded in Mesopotamia somewhere between 2330 and 2340 BCE. And I'm not exact because we don't know. And was founded, its founder is said to be Sargon of Akkad, not that one, the actual Sargon of Akkad, not the washed up British guy. And this is a kind of a collection of city-states running basically to the Gulf up towards Palestine. And this empire is it is this collection of city-states, and they owe nominal loyalty to the central ruler. But like, it's not like the ruler is checking in on the cities every day type situation, because he can't. They are separated by miles and miles and miles. So what do these empires expect? The empire's ruler expects you to pay tribute to the empire. And that can come in a couple different forms, usually money, taxation. The extent of an empire really is the extent of its territory that it can actively tax. But the other thing is probably going to end up in times of war being soldiers. And because of this, and because of this need to be able to tax it, and this bureaucratic limitations that are created by, not having radios and telegraphs and similar technology, most of these empires tend to be comprised of adjoining territories. There are some examples that you can cite of pre-modern empires that build themselves differently. Rome and Carthage, I think, are good examples. But for the most part, a lot of these empires sort of built themselves contiguously. And they almost always had this elite class that could be very separate from the people who are being ruled. The example Galvin gives is the Russian Empire, where the imperial court spoke French and everyone else spoke the various languages that constituted the Russian Empire, Russian, other languages as such. And you could see this too in places like Rome, where not everyone speaks Latin more often than not. For the most part, as long as you paid tribute and didn't rebel, your day probably went on much as it did after being conquered as before. And this is a fundamental difference, I think, between the empires of the past and the early modern period, and that we're going to be talking about these early these later modern empires and contemporary ones. There isn't really an effort to standardize or control populations. There's some minor exceptions, but for the most part, these empires exist in a kind of almost laissez-faire state of affairs. As long as you don't rebel, you're not going to see much input from the imperial center. And even then, for example, you won't necessarily see it from the imperial center. You'll see it from an appointed governor. The big example I like, because it perfectly highlights how A, this works, and B, it can all go terribly wrong, is the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which is a conflict between Germanic tribes and the Romans in shortly after the Second Wars of the Triumvirate. Augustus is emperor, and he is ruling from Rome. And Germania is more or less supposed to be occupied in a Roman territory. And the commander of the Roman legions is a man by the name of Varius, and he has a local allied ruler called Arminius. And so Varius is a Roman governor and a politician and a general, and he understands his duties as such. And he is told by Arminius of a rebellion somewhere down the road in that deep, dark forest. And so he gets up and he grabs his legions and he grabs the auxiliaries and he marches off in a massive column to go confront this rebellion and put it down, because that's what a Roman general does. And they get into the deep, dark forests, and Arminius runs off, disappears, and suddenly there are Germans everywhere. And over the course of several days, these 3 Roman legions are utterly destroyed, because it turns out that the rebellion was in the camp the whole time. It was Arminius. And this is largely how it works. So Augustus, the emperor in Rome, had nothing to do with it. All he knew was after the fact he lost 3 legions. And quite famously, the story goes that he would go out wandering the halls of the palace saying, "Varius, Varius, give me back my legions." And this is kind of how these empires function for the most part. Persia is another great example, especially a great example in the face of how we frame the Achaemenid Persian Empire versus the Greek city-states that they are classically fighting in much of the famous stories of Western canon, like the Battle of Marathon or the Battle of Thermopylae. The movie 300, I think, is a really big oof for most people who are interested in history, because obviously there's the fantastical elements, but the way it presents Sparta, a society that is built on the idle rich sitting on top of a pile of slaves, as some kind of beacon of freedom against these tyrannical, horrible Persians. And in reality, most of the citizens of the Persian Empire paid taxes and were left alone. And there's the Spartans enslaving people left, right, and center over the Peloponnesus. So,
well, it's interesting too, because like the Spartans in particular were famous as a paranoid slave society that lived in perpetual fear of the Helots rising up. That entire slave class that outnumbered the actual Spartan citizens. Meanwhile, the Persians, they were largely non-interventionist. They wanted tribute and they wanted a contingency in times of war.
yes.
But they didn't really bother with the cultures. In fact, they as a sign of their strength when they would invade, it wasn't like in 300 where it's just, oh, look at this horde of strangely Saracen looking soldiers lined up. It was an assemblage of different cultures peacocking and looking as diverse as possible to demonstrate just how widely they'd conquered.
And it wasn't an ineffective army for much of its history either, at all.
Well, as a result of like conquering all those different groups, they had that diversity. So they had troops for almost every single occasion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Compared to the much more, there's a lot of good lectures, and I threw one up in the History channel in the Cathedral today in response to a user posting about stuff. Stick 'em with the pointy end. Amateurism in Greek warfare, worth a watch. The guy who does the lecture, you will recognize if you've watched those insider videos where they go, early ancient historian rates battle scenes from movies. He's the Ditch guy. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. It's horribly Scandinavian.
There's also a great book. If it's dated, but it's still standard. A.T. Olmsted's the Persian Empire is History of the Persian Empire is fantastic and beautifully written, which is not always the case for history books. Sometimes they're very rote and very mechanical. History is one of those disciplines where it's often the case that you get like a lot of like really gorgeous writing as well, but sometimes, especially like with contemporary politics, a lot of it's just it's like journalism but overly long.
I
That's
appreciate
one of those ones that's just
one of the ones I appreciate if you're getting into broadly American military history. It's a bit dated at this point, but James Stokesville Canadian historian. He wrote a series of books basically called A Short History of World War I, World War II, the American Revolution, etc. He has this wonderfully dry prose that is makes him eminently readable if you do not necessarily always enjoy military history. In answer to your question, Pippa, I presume you are referring to the Delian League. And I will go from there. So the Delian League was a alliance, I guess is the best word to put it, centered on Athens. And it was formed with the express purpose of creating a force to oppose Persia in the oppose Persian takeover of the Greek, not continent, but country side. And is it an empire? Yes, kind of, sort of. What it really is, it turns into that, I think is the best way to put it. What it is the Athenians take money from all the member states, all the member city-states, and they build a giant navy, and presumably they weren't thinking that much about the army, but they build a giant navy, and they use it to kind of bully the other Greek city-states around a little bit. And this is eventually becomes unsatisfactory to them. But like, if you look at the fundamental force, it is this collection of city-states. They are paying tribute ostensibly for protection, so it's also kind of a early protection racket. And in a lot of ways, it reflects this sense of empire. And also, Athenians get kind of snooty in a lot of their writing, so you can kind of see that elitism thing too. So yeah, I would classify it as, yes, kind of, sort of imperial. Some people would argue with me. Funny story about two of these things. I did a paper as an undergrad where I was assigned to compare and contrast three things from history. So I picked empires, ancient empires, and I picked the Akkadian Empire, the Delian League, and the Roman Empire just after the fall of the Republic. Picking the Akkadian Empire to do an undergrad history paper is a horrible idea. Don't do it. Just awful. I spent like 2 weeks sitting there trying to become an archaeologist. It was a bad idea.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, because like, I think like the Delian League is certainly a hegemony. Is it generally considered an empire? It depends on who you're talking to, but I think the major difference is when you went to war with the Roman Empire, you went to war with Rome and her empire. When you went to war with Athens, you went to war with Athens. And Athens had to go around convincing the other polises to come on its side, which is different.
Yes. I think the thing I tend to think about Rome, especially later Rome, is they're pulling armies in a very different way. So you still have to get a certain amount of consensus inside Rome, but because they really do have the first standing professional army in Europe, after the Marian reforms, right? What Athens kind of did was they took everyone else's military capacity, because Greek warfare is very, again, great lecture, amateurish. Everybody gets together and they say, we're going to form an army and we're going to put this guy in charge and we're going to go fight a battle. And then win or lose, that's it. We're coming home because we got to do the economy again. We got to go farm and tend our land. And this is like hoplites they're purchasing their own equipment and all that. And that is a pretty common thing throughout most of history. So like, by taking that resource and investing it in the way the Athenians did, they kind of are doing that, but really inefficiently. So if you're going to argue that it's not an empire, I think we can maybe argue that it's a really bad one. Like, it was a bad idea.
Well, I like that you bring up the lack of a standing army, because I think that's another major factor as well. Because when you're talking about Rome, Rome had like its own committed like legionaries, and it had its own forces that belonged to Rome. And in a sense, like as an yeah, but as an enforcing thing, like there were bodies that were continuous with Rome that were that actually went and governed like these different these different, I don't know what you call them, like vassal states or whatever, the different states that were within its hegemony. Again, when you're talking about Athens, you're talking about a time in which the center of focus really is on the polis itself, and there really isn't this notion of the polis body sort of extending over other cities, which is why you have it where the greatness of a part of what is speculated to be the motivation for the attack by the Lacedaemonians or the Spartans against the Athenians is precisely that what was growing greater was also this democratic culture, sort of this general uh, political spirit of Athens that was very threatening to other cultures that, for example, were very restrictive and relied upon like very large populations of subjugated peoples and slaves and whatnot. Um, so it's like, in a certain sense, empire as such was partially inconceivable, even if it was sort of latent there, anyways, because you do have this hegemonic polis that is absolutely like subjecting other cities to its whims at the end of a sword and exacting tribute and using that to contribute to a broader military. I think actually arguably a foil for the standing army because while it's true, they also had Athens had one of the first standing navies. Because one of the unique
Yes.
things about triremes is that they have zero economic value. They're not good for trade. They're very low space, and they require and therefore they require like training by people who are doing nothing else but that. So triremes now all of a sudden require an entire specialized class, and so in a sense you do have sort of your legion of the sea, so to speak, that becomes even identified with Athens in a similar way as the legionaries were sort of identified with Rome. But I'm taking up your time. My apologies, Daedalus. Back to you. I just thought that was a really really interesting point you were making.
No, I appreciate it. I also like, while we're on the topic of people at sea, one of the things I love, if you ever go reading the ancient accounts of the Punic Wars, is how Rome deals with navies, because they have to come up with this navy and they don't know how to do it in the Second Punic War and to a certain extent the first. And so they like, well, how can we take ships and turn them into armies? And they put a giant battering ram on the top of the ship and smacked it down and ran across it. I love it. That's problem solving, thinking with portals. Where are we at? How are we doing? Does anyone have? Here we go. Can empires be made of one? I'm checking through questions. Apologies. An empire be made of a collaborative and coercion? Well, to a certain extent, I think they are, at least in pre-modern and ancient empires and early modern empires, are a combination of collaboration and coercion. It is this dual nature of the thing. On the one hand, I can kick your ass, and on the other hand, look at all this cool stuff I can give you. That's a big part of it, particularly in when you think about Rome, because this is very much the Roman model. Is we're going to march into your province, except you don't call it a province yet, you just call it home. We're going to give you this offer: become a Roman, pay some taxes, continue living, or fight, and we're going to all have a rough time. And so this is this combination of coercion.
Well, if you don't have any other questions,
Yeah, I think we're good. For
are we about ready to wrap up, Daedalus, or did you have anything else you wanted to cover quickly? Or
I think we want to do early modern empires, some kind of network or a little bit of an explanation of them real quick, and then we can move on for the night. So the contrast, rather, I mean, we're going to be talking, principally going off the book that we have been reading, or at least I have started reading. I hope everyone else has. The PDF is in.
And reminder, guys, for anyone in the chat or in the audience right now, if you go into the Discord server for every single upcoming episode, which will be hosted by different people, the PDFs of everything that we'll be using is going to be made available there. So you can just download it from there. And they'll have reading sections and so on and so forth and topics explained and things of that sort. So if you're interested in following along with the next ones, they're all going to be different. Join into the Discord. Sorry, Dallas, as you were.
No worries. So, what is the difference, I think, when you start to see these new empires emerging, these empires in Spain throughout the New World, and England and France? And I think the biggest difference is that you have vast separations of space that are being administered in long distances in a way that would not have been possible before. Like the Roman Empire is a large empire, but it is, for the most part, contiguous. You cannot say the same for the Spanish Empire or the Portuguese or the British. And this emerges over time where you have this metropolitan center like London, Paris, Madrid, and that they're ruling over these populations that are very far away, and they are appointing governors for them, and they are imposing taxes upon them, and they are doing all these things and making these spaces, building out these imperial adventures and building out these corporate adventures to finance it all in a way that just wouldn't have happened in a lot of ways because of the interplay between mercantilism and nationalism. You start to see cases where there are colonies that get established that lose money in the short term, so on the hope of a long-term gain. So it's not necessarily always a simple prospect of what you're getting immediately as an imperial power. It sometimes is, what can I exploit later on down the road? Certain Middle East countries could learn from the Romans, I suppose. They probably kind of did when you consider that they kind of gave us most of those Greek and Roman philosophers in the first place. So this is a major difference. And the other difference is they kind of are looking to impose their own sense of nationalism on their empires, a sense of belonging to these faraway ruled places. And that in a lot of ways starts to define where some of the brutality that we see in imperialism really comes in. I can't imagine that we're not going to talk about things like the native schools here in the United States and Canada, or the Ecumendus system in Spanish America and Mexico, and the concept of slavery, and where all these things start to come in is this sense of superiority, the sense of being British, being Spanish, etc. That you must now have too, in addition to me, the imperial power, right? This is a dramatically different form of empire than you originally imagined, and in a certain sense, it continues on towards the ostensible imperial powers of today. American territories are very similarly educated to American students about the United States. In a lot of ways, you see a lot of the same apparatus. So that is it. I have ran through my thing.
All right, Daedalus, thank you very much. This has been the first episode. It's been largely a test just to make sure that we have this sort of sorted. We know what problems to address in the future. I think obviously like layout, I'm going to work on a little bit. One of the catches here is if we want to switch between having the host or their documents taking up the full screen or not, the way Discord does this is it's on a single button thing, which is frustrating because it means I can't have two different windows prepared unless I have one really zoomed in, which is awkward for various reasons. So we might just have to stick with this kind of format unless we decide to go with like StreamYard or something, which I might do. But
Yeah,
it does cause
probably
limitations with the audience in the Discord server though. So we'll see. We'll play it by ear. I think also what we might do is just not use the stage function and just use a normal group and then have people take part that way. But
well, I wanted to try it, so I put it here.
Well, I appreciate it. I actually no, you didn't. I put it here. I did this. You were in the other chat.
No, I put the symposium and you put the other chat there. I just made the stage for when we were going to.
Oh, you made the symposium. Yeah. Oh, I was wondering where that came from. Okay. Anyways, Daedalus, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
The next one's going to be Zanzi on Sunday. I think I'm gonna get confirmation with him on that, and then Shakespeare on Tuesday, and then we're going from there. I will probably be hosting one as well next week. I don't have a particular date set. I'm probably going to be focusing a little bit more on the Columbus case because I'm finding the conquistadors very fascinating at the moment. But thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And if for whatever reason you don't have a membership, this is mostly for Daedalus's audience. All of these streams will be available on the host's channel after they are streamed, and they will not be members only. So if you enjoy this content or you enjoy the host, you can find Daedalus's channel at Two Guys Talking History on YouTube. It'll be linked in the description.
We would appreciate the sub. We are on the march to 1,000 still.
And he will have a non-paywalled version of this this presentation there. I think I will raid you guys out just because why the hell not? Is Kid Not Kin live? Who's live right now? Who's smart? Yeah, he is. All right. Have a good night, everyone, and I will see you on Monday. Take it easy.
Good night.